ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട രാമകൃഷ്ണൻ, സദസ്സിലെ അധ്യാപക സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾ, വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾ, എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. രാമകൃഷ്ണൻ നമുക്ക് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിന് പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് അപരിചിതനല്ല. എന്ന് മാത്രമല്ല, നമ്മളുടെ പല ഫങ്ഷൻസിലും മുഖ്യ അതിഥിയായി വന്നിട്ടുള്ള ആളാണ്. ഈ കഴിഞ്ഞ പ്രാവശ്യം തന്നെ സി ഹാരിസിന് വേണ്ടി സംസാരിക്കാൻ ഇദ്ദേഹം EVR ആയിരുന്നു ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നത്. അതെനിക്ക് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിലെ മാത്രമല്ല വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾക്കും വളരെ പരിചിതനാണ്. അദ്ദേഹത്തെ നേരിട്ട് കണ്ടിട്ടില്ലെങ്കിൽ പോലും അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പുസ്തകങ്ങളിലൂടെ മലയാളത്തിലായാലും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലായാലും ബൈലിംഗ്വലായി തന്നെ കൂടുതലും എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നത് മലയാളത്തിലെ പ്രബന്ധങ്ങൾ തന്നെയാണ് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ വളരെ പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷനായിട്ട് ഞങ്ങളൊക്കെ കാണുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ അതിലുപരി അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഇൻട്രൊഡക്ഷന് വേണ്ടി ഞാൻ ഒന്ന് രണ്ട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറയാം. അദ്ദേഹം ഗുജറാത്തിലെ അറിയുന്നവർ ക്ഷമിക്കുക, ഗുജറാത്തിലെ കേന്ദ്ര സർവകലാശാലയിൽ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പ്രൊഫസറായിരുന്നു. പ്രൊഫസറായിരുന്നു എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഇപ്പോഴും പ്രൊഫസർ തന്നെയാണ്. പ്രൊഫസർ പോകുന്ന ഒരാൾ പിന്നീട് പ്രൊഫസർ അല്ലാതാകുന്നില്ല, പ്രൊഫസർ തന്നെയാണ്, പ്രൊഫസറാണ്. അദ്ദേഹം 2015 റിട്ടയർ ചെയ്തു എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴും അതിനുശേഷം എമറിറ്റസ് പ്രൊഫസറായി അദ്ദേഹം വർക്ക് ചെയ്തിരുന്നു. ഈ അടുത്ത 2000 കോവിഡ് സമയത്തിൻ്റെ തൊട്ട് അടുത്തൊരു ഘട്ടത്തിലാണ് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സ്ഥലമായ പയ്യന്നൂരിലേക്ക് വരുന്നതും അവിടെ സ്വത്താമസം തുടരുന്നതും അതിനുശേഷമാണ്. അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പുസ്തകങ്ങളുടെ ലിസ്റ്റ് തന്നെ ഉണ്ട്. നമ്മൾ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സ് ഒരു വലിയ കാര്യം ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. ആദ്യഘട്ടം മുതൽ തന്നെ, പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും നമ്മുടെ MPhil വിഷയത്തിൽ തന്നെ അക്ഷരവും ആധുനികതയും നമ്മുടെ നിർബന്ധ വിഷയങ്ങളിലൊന്നായിരുന്നു. ഇപ്പോൾ ഈ അടുത്ത കാലത്ത് MPhil തീരുന്നത് വരെ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പുസ്തകം പഠിക്കാനുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അതിൻ്റെ പ്രാധാന്യം എന്താണെന്നുള്ളത് സത്യം പറഞ്ഞാൽ അത് പഠിച്ചതിന് ശേഷമാണ് നമ്മൾ അറിയുന്നത്. അക്ഷരവും ആധുനികതയും. ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ വിശദീകരണത്തിലേക്ക് പോകുന്നില്ല. 92 പുസ്തകമാണ്. ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഏറ്റവും അധികം എന്നെപ്പോലെയൊക്കെയുള്ള വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾ PhD കാലത്തൊക്കെ നമ്മുടെ മുമ്പിൽ വന്ന വളരെ പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട പുസ്തകമാണ് വാക്കിലെ സമൂഹം. പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും മറ്റ് സൈദ്ധാന്തികർ അരങ്ങഴിഞ്ഞ് നിൽക്കുന്നൊരു സമയത്ത് ഒരു ഘട്ടത്തിൽ ഭക്തിൻ്റെ ആശയങ്ങൾ, ഭക്തിൻ്റെ തന്നെ പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ കൃത്യമായി പറഞ്ഞാൽ കുഞ്ചൻ നമ്പ്യാരുടെ തുള്ളൽ ആസ്പദമാക്കി അതിൽ ഇതെങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ ബഹുസ്വരതയുടെയും മറ്റും സാധ്യതകൾ എങ്ങനെ കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നു എന്നുള്ളത് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു മലയാളത്തിൽ അത്രയും പ്രായോഗിക തലത്തിൽ അത്രയും ഒരു വർക്ക് വന്നതായി എനിക്ക് അറിയില്ല. എൻ്റെ വായനയുടെ കുഴപ്പം കൊണ്ടുകൂടിയാണെന്ന് കുട്ടിയാണ്, പക്ഷെ ഇല്ല എന്ന് തന്നെ വിചാരിക്കുന്നു. പിന്നീട് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ദേശീയതകളും സാഹിത്യവും അത് ഇടക്കാലത്ത് വന്നിരുന്ന ഈ ഒരു സീരീസിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമായി വരുന്നൊരു അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു പുതിയ പതിപ്പ് താമസിയാതെ ചെയ്യാൻ തയ്യാറായിട്ടുണ്ടെന്ന് മനസ്സിലാകുന്നു. പിന്നുള്ളത് അനുഭവങ്ങളെ ആർക്കാണ് പേടി? അത് മിക്കവാറും DC ആണ് ഇതെല്ലാം കൊണ്ടുപോയിരിക്കുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ എവിടെ എത്തി എന്നുള്ളത് നമുക്കറിയില്ല. ഇത്തരം പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ എത്തേണ്ട സ്ഥലത്ത് എത്തിയോ എന്നുള്ളത് മറ്റൊരു കാര്യം. അതിൽ മറ്റൊന്നുള്ളത് അനുഭവങ്ങളെ ആർക്കാണ് പേടി. അതേപോലെ മലയാള നോവലിൻ്റെ ദേശകാലങ്ങൾ ഇതുവരെയാണ് അറിയുന്ന ഒരു പുസ്തകങ്ങളുണ്ട്. ഞാനത് കാണാത്തത് കൊണ്ട് ആ പേര് ഞാൻ പറയുന്നില്ല. പുസ്തകം ഒരെണ്ണം കൂടെ ഉണ്ട്, പക്ഷെ അത് വായിക്കാത്ത ഒരാൾക്ക് പറയാൻ പറ്റില്ല ഇതിലില്ലതാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഇതേ വിധത്തിൽ നമ്മുടെ ഒരർത്ഥത്തിൽ അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ നമ്മൾ ഈ ബൈലിംഗ്വൽ ആയതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ വന്നിട്ടുള്ള പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട പുസ്തകങ്ങളൊന്നും ഞാനൊക്കെ അത് കോപ്പി എടുത്ത് പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്ത് കിടക്കുന്നതിന് പുസ്തക ലൈബ്രറിയിൽ നിന്ന് എടുത്ത് കോപ്പി എടുത്ത് വെച്ചിരിക്കുന്ന പുസ്തകങ്ങളൊന്നാണ് മേക്കിംഗ് ഇറ്റ് ന്യൂ മോഡേണിസം ഇൻ മലയാളം, മറാഠി ആൻഡ് ഹിന്ദി പോയിട്രി. തുടർന്ന് അദ്ദേഹം നോവലുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടും കഥകളുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ടും ഒക്കെയുള്ള എഡിറ്റഡ് വോളിയൂംസ് കേന്ദ്ര സാഹിത്യ അക്കാദമിയുടെ ഭാഗമായി വന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതെല്ലാം തന്നെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ തന്നെയാണ് കൂടുതൽ. ഇത്തരത്തിൽ ഒരു ബഹുമുഖ പ്രതിഭ എന്നൊക്കെ ഉള്ള വാക്ക് ഞാൻ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നില്ല, പക്ഷേ ചെയ്തതൊക്കെ പ്രതിഭാധനൻ എന്നുള്ള നിലയ്ക്ക് നമ്മളെ ഓർമ്മപ്പെടുത്തുന്ന ഒരു സാന്നിധ്യമാണ് അദ്ദേഹം. ഞാനത് കൂടുതൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ വിശദീകരിക്കേണ്ട ഒരു സമയമല്ല, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും അത്തരം ഒരു കാര്യത്തിലേക്ക് പോകാവുന്നതാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ട് എല്ലാവർക്കും വേണ്ടി നമ്മുടെ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിലെ എല്ലാ സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾക്കും അധ്യാപകർക്കും ഇവിടെയുള്ള വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾ, സദസ്സിലുള്ള മറ്റ് സ്നേഹിതർ എല്ലാവരെയും കൂടി ചേർത്തുകൊണ്ട് സാറിനോട് ഈ ചടങ്ങിലേക്ക് വരികയും സാറിൻ്റെ പ്രഭാഷണത്തിലേക്ക് കടക്കണമെന്ന് അഭ്യർത്ഥിക്കുകയാണ്.
താങ്ക് യു പ്രൊഫസർ രാധാകൃഷ്ണൻ. എന്നെ സംബന്ധിച്ചോളം സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സ് ഒരു വളരെ ആഴമുള്ള ഗഹനമായിട്ടുള്ളൊരു ഓർമ്മയാണ്. ഐ ഹോപ്പ് there are some people who can't follow Malayalam. Should I? So Eliot was in a way transforming the avant-garde sensibility into the English poetic mode. And he also brought about a new kind of relation between content and form. You see, when form becomes central in a work of art, like look at Waiting for Godot. If a teacher wants to teach it, the most difficult thing will be to paraphrase. The only way you can paraphrase Waiting for Godot is to repeat the dialogues of, the play. There is no way you can paraphrase it. Same with the Wasteland. It is unparaphrasable. It has hardly any continuity between the first 3 lines and the next 3 lines. It's more of a cinematic sequence. I used to tell my students, if you want to visualize this poem, you should actually think of a series of frames, sequence of filmic scenes moving before you. Sometimes it's a landscape, sometimes it is a scene in a bar, sometimes it is the demobbed soldiers actually talking, and maybe there are many such. So you can visualize this poem as a dramatic kind of sequence of frames. And the word modernism itself, actually it's not a monolithic movement. Neither was it a monolithic movement in Europe, nor was it a monolithic movement in India. I will come to the Indian scene in a few minutes. Let me actually add, because of its multilinguality, because of the rejection of the idea of Englishness itself, maybe because of a certain projection of cosmopolitan worldview, beginning with Chaucer but ending with Vaijnanika Upanishad. Look at the footnotes given by T.S. Eliot. I think footnotes refer to texts from so many languages. You need to actually relate to many languages, many cultures to understand what this poem is doing. And perhaps the war itself, perhaps we have forgotten the war in Ukraine. But when you see those scenes, when you see displacement, how do you relate to the idea of displacement? In fact, my argument is Eliot was a displaced person, and Wasteland was one of those poems which expressed the idea of displacement with such force that it could not be spoken in the idea of national language. It challenged, it disrupted the idea of the national language or national expression. It exceeds the very idea of, if there are questions on why I argue along these lines, I can explain later. When we come toward the Indian scene, it took a long time for the Wasteland to capture the imagination of Indian readers. As it very often happens, Bengali becomes one language which relates to the idea of modernism in English in the 30s itself. By 30s, there are winds of change in Bengali poetry. You know, Tagore was a larger-than-life presence in Bengali, and it was not easy to question the father figure who actually controlled the entire. Tagore was not a poet alone. He was a novelist, short story writer, a musician, a dramatist, a painter. So he was a Renaissance person. So his presence had actually, it influenced not only Bengali, across many other languages. Almost all North Indian languages came under his great influence. So when a new generation of Bengali poets, among whom were Buddhadev Bose, Sudhindranath Datta, Samarsan, Vishnudev, Vivekananda Das, all of them, they actually moved away from Tagore's mode of expression, Tagore's way of mystical and metaphysical poetry. Tagore's expression, Tagore has a brand. You only have to actually see one line. You don't have to be a Bengali. If you hear a line from Tagore, you will recognize this is Tagore. So, by 30s, there is a gradual moving away from a certain mystical, metaphysical idiom which had become the canonical form of poetry in Bengali. And you find this had become inevitable. This shift in sensibility was not something which Tagore actually would have welcomed. It came gradually, you see, through many. Amiyadev has an interesting comment. It was not because Bengali poets imbued modernism that Adhunik Bengali writers turned away from Rabindranath. On the contrary, modernism was the means by which they turned away from Rabindranath, and they had to turn away, for their history demanded it. Amiyadev പറയുന്നത് ഇതാണ്, 30കളിൽ ടാഗോറിൻ്റെതായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു കവിതാ രീതിയിൽ നിന്ന് വഴിമാറി നടക്കാൻ ബംഗാളി കവികൾ നിർബന്ധിതരായിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അത് ചരിത്രത്തിന്റെ തന്നെ ആവശ്യമായിരുന്നു. അത് അവർ ആധുനികത വന്നത് കൊണ്ടല്ല ആധുനിക കവിത എഴുതിയത്. ആധുനികത എന്ന ഒരു ആശയ ലോകത്തിന്റെ ഒരു അനിവാര്യത അവര് സ്വീകരിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു. അതിനൊരു അനിവാര്യതയില്ല. ഇറ്റ് വാസ് ഇന്നവിറ്റബിൾ. They had to actually move in a different direction. So modernism was not something important. ഇത് വിദേശത്ത് നിന്ന് ഇറക്കുമതി ചെയ്ത ഒരു സാധനമല്ല. It was not Bengali or it was not Eliot in Bengali dress. It was not English poetry with a Bengali kind of dress. It was something which actually responded to the ground realities which were shifting. The ground was shifting. And if you know the history of the sensibility, you see, sensibilities need to reinvent themselves. Poetry, fiction, drama, they keep reinventing themselves because of the pressure of reality. This is not because somebody sitting in London writes a poem, so suddenly we become Adhunika. That's not the thing. Things are changing. You see, 1930s, definitely I don't want to go into literary history or social history. The urbanization, the kind of national movement gaining momentum, a lot of things. So we also have the idea of, I don't want to actually enter into the debate, progressive literary movement. You see, progressive literature had its great impact on Urdu, Hindi, Malayalam. In Malayalam, it's sometimes Purogamana Sahityam, Jival Sahityam. So the idea of modernism gradually took shape in India, in Indian languages, through several debates. It was not accepted very easily. For example, in Hindi, I can actually see whether you should actually have Pragati or Pragati is Purogamana, progress, or whether you should have experimental kind of poetry. So, between experimentalism and progressivism, there was this question, which actually is, are they together? There are lots of issues which are being discussed. In 1943, I will mention 2 or 3 things about Bengali and then I will actually come to Hindi. See, when you look at the Bengali poetry, you find a poet like Jibanananda. Jibanananda is perhaps the most important post-Tagore Bengali poet. I don't know how many of you have heard about a poet like Jibanananda. Jibanananda's poetry has been studied by an American scholar. There is a wonderful book called A Poet Apart. And when Jibanananda wrote in the 30s, Tagore himself published some of his poems. But Tagore also found there is a certain kind of, he would actually call it, it's not a kind of poetry which talks about Saundarya. It was not a kind of poetry which talks about, for example, he has a poem called At the Camp, or there are poems about the street culture. You see, I have seen the face of Bengal, very, very stark reality which came into the poetic mode. One very famous poem he wrote in the 30s, it's called Banalada Sen. I don't know whether you have heard about this. I will only read a few lines here and there. Sorry, my harsh voice, I am recovering from a throat infection. I have walked the roads across the earth's breast for 1,000 years in the darkness of night. I have ranged far from Ceylon waters to the Malay Sea. In Bimbisar and Ashok's grey world have I been, and the still distant darkness of Vidarbha, a tired being I am, round me lies forming seas. Benalada son of Natu gave me a moment's peace. You see, Ayyappa Panikar has translated Benalada son into Malayalam. He has commented on his poetry. Why a poem by Benalada, a poem of this kind becomes important for poets like Ayyappa Panikar? Mainly because it brings in a new kind of mode, a new kind of tone. And you can actually, even when you read through poems of Jibanananda these days, you find he has moved away from Tagore and he has actually created a world mainly of rural Bengal. Rural Bengal, he will never actually, in Tagore's poetry, you will find common lines, words like river or tree. But Jibanananda will never talk about a tree, he will mention the tree. He will mention the tree in a particular village. He will talk about memory of that village. So specific, so particular. And his way of evoking the landscape of Bengal. Perhaps this has been done with such visual imagination only by cinematographers like Satyajit Ray, and later you will find the rural Bengal came alive in the film medium. So the shift comes in the 30s in Bengal. This is the point I am making. And Tagore was sensitive enough to understand that his primacy in poetry is shifting now. He also mentioned some of these poets are more like Aghorpanthis. If you know, Aghorpanthi is a secret sect of people who deliberately worship filth or who practice things which are ugly. They don't actually talk about poetry or they don't talk about beauty. And so Tagore was highly critical of the early modernists in Bengali. And we should remember Samarsen wrote an article attacking Tagore. Buddhadev Bose sent him a volume of prose poems. And Tagore, in the last volume of his poetry, he actually starts writing prose poetry. If Tagore had lived for another 20 years, he would have become a modernist poet. Tagore understood the sensibility is changing, and he captured that idiom. He tried to actually renew himself. Three elements are noticeable. One is the question of metaphysical, mystical worldviews that's gradually losing its significance. Secondly, you find a new relation between form and content. See, form becomes an ideologically potent force. Earlier I mentioned, one of the major impact of Wasteland was, Wasteland tells you, if I don't have, I didn't carry the Wasteland text, but take any line, any passage from Wasteland and read it aloud, you will find its sound structure communicates a lot. There is a certain kind of experiential layer coming alive through its sound structure. And this sound structure, in a way, goes back to orality, oral poetry. About Waiting for Godot, it is said that some of those lines, they are exactly like free verse. He actually took so much time to write this short play. So sound becomes a medium of sound images. And you should also remember, there is this very important, insightful remark by Walter Benjamin, who talks about, the wanderer in the city, flâneur, F-L-A-N-E-U-R, this is a French word. This is a 19th century cultural phenomenon. In cities like Paris, there is a new kind of culture. People wander through streets. Streets have now become full of arcades. Benjamin writes about this street culture, the arcades which have come up, and people wandering, gazing. And you do not actually belong to the city, but you pass through the city all the time. When you start reading a poem like Prufrock's love song, the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like an etherized patient on a table. If you go through the poem, it's the flanner, it's the wanderer, it's the gaze of the wandering city man who doesn't belong to the city. You see, he keeps saying, I cannot be Prince Hamlet. You see, he's worried about his head going bald. And toward the end of the poem, he actually, there is a sinking feeling. He can hear mermaids. You see, this flanner, the organizing principle of the poem, like the wasteland, have to be located in such narrative, dramatic voices. Another way of locating a continuity, I said, is through the medium of the film. You can see the poem as a filmatic or a cinematic sequence, or you can see that as the hallucinated mind of a wandering city person who actually cannot locate himself. As I said, he is a displaced being. He is not, you see, somebody who belongs to the culture, to the city. So he gave expression to this state of extreme alienation, not from the society alone, from himself. He can only conceive of himself as echoes, you see, through echoes and multiple voices, which are actually, you see, and you need to remember the idea of a central principle like English society, or the idea of a central culture like English culture is no more operating in a poem like The Wasteland. This must have attracted, this must have actually motivated poets in Bengal as well as Hindi. D.R. Nagaraj, I don't know how many of you are aware of this Kannada critic. He is a very important critic. He asked this question, how, you see, if you look at the poets in Indian languages, I mentioned the major poets from Bengal. Look at Gopalakrishna Adiga, the Kannada modernist, or Umashankar Joshi, the Gujarati poet who gradually moved towards modernism. I have mentioned Buddhadev Bose. You can also see a series of poets like Mardekar, Dilip Chitre, a number of younger poets. So all these poets are actually now responding to a certain impulse which became available through The Wasteland. The Wasteland definitely had touched upon a deep core. I wouldn't say, and now we don't talk about influence. I think at least in comparative literature as a discipline, we don't think there is a master text which actually impacts all other smaller texts. We think, you see, if you are receiving something, you receive some text, that does not actually happen without mediation. For example, in a situation like COVID, you may be rereading Decameron, you may be rereading Camus' The Plague. So definitely something that happens in your local culture, in your regional kind of context, affects the shaping of the sensibility. You receive something, you read something, relate to it only through the mediation of the local, regional, the temporal, So all these you can actually see a new form of several dramatic way of putting together the speech channels which become available through the wasteland. All that must have actually inspired a whole lot of Marathi, Malayalam, many other language poets. And let me also mention that it was through literary criticism that modernism gradually evolved. Ayyappa Panikar, for example, in Malayalam, in 1960s, early 1960s, he writes an essay on T.S. Eliot. And in that essay, it's a very early essay, perhaps the very first essay written in Malayalam on T.S. Eliot is by Ayyappa Panikar, where he says, Eliot is the poet of minority. And he also mentions poetry is not something written in meter. Poetry is something which actually gives a new shape, a new form to experience, and this form should originate not through conventional kind of meter or conventional kind of poetic idea. The form should be something dictated by the experience itself. And there is a scathing attack which Ayyappa Panikar makes on Vallathu. You see, this you find almost in all Indian languages, whether I said Samarsen attacking Tagore, Agay attacking the Chayavadi poets or Rahasyavadi poets in Hindi like Sumitranandan Pant, Mahadevi Varma. So those poets were attacked by a new generation of modernists. Mardhekar in Marathi or Chitre in Marathi, they are attacking Keshav Soot. So the romantic poets who had already made a name for, and they were all father figures. And that's why Anantamurti says there is a kind of Tagore syndrome in Indian languages. Tagore syndrome means it's a kind of children turning against father. You see, there is a kind of attack on father. You cannot create new literature if you are obedient, if you are like a shishya holding your hands. It's only by rejecting, questioning, disrupting that a new voice, a new idiom can come. And that's why when Ayyappa Panikar wrote in a minor small journal called Jagrada, 1964, he said, Vallathu lacks intellectual honesty. Right. In those days, it must have actually sounded a very harsh criticism. He says Vallathu goes to China and writes a poem, China Ha. He goes to Russia, comes back, writes a poem, Russia Ha. So, by 1960s, we know what really happened in Russia, what Stalin was doing in Russia. So if you are intellectually honest, you should also write another poem against Stalin. But these are all poems which celebrate certain kind of, visits or occasions. And this has created poetry as a kind of utilitarian mode of expression. It doesn't have enduring form. It doesn't communicate experience. So what modernist poetry was trying to say, form demands a certain level of experimentation. Form is not like a glass where I pour my anubhavam. You see, it's not something ready-made. If I have a new experience, I will have to find a new form for that. So Kurukshetram, he wrote Kurukshetram for about 7-8 years. So Ayyappa Panikar was struggling with words, struggling with lines. It did not come as a fluent, narrative in one go, he was struggling with the lack of experience. This question comes up again and again in Nai Kavita in Hindi, Adhunik Kavita in Marathi, or Adhunik Kavita in Telugu, or you say in Adiga's poetry in Canada, almost everywhere. For example, Mardekar is a poet who in 1948 brought out a book called Kahi Kavita. And in Kahi Kavita you hear the voice of a medieval kind of poet. You see, the experience is modern, contemporary, metropolitan, but he uses Tukaram's Abhang. Now we suppose you use Pundanam Jnanapana style and talk about your railway journey from Ernakulam to Trivandrum. You will find the poem suddenly has a certain level of irony because it disrupts your expectation. What do you expect from a poem? Usually any meter, Keka or Manjari or any, you see, they create a certain rhythm, a cadence, so they also condition the experience. The moment you put an experience in Kega kind of chandas, vritam, the poem itself speaks in a different way. It's not speaking your experience. Kega has its own way of processing experience. These are ways of formulating experience. So borrowing traditional meters is a way of disowning our experience. Then you lose intellectual honesty. So Panikar's actually argument was, if you want poetry in Malayalam to respond to be contemporaneous with your experience, you need to actually disrupt the prevailing metrical patterns and create a new cadence, new rhythm, new sound structure. That's why I said earlier, in Eliot, you find a kind of orality. There are long passages in Kurukshetram which you cannot paraphrase. You cannot actually say this is what they mean. You cannot say this is how the poem proceeds. The poem demands a certain kind of deep involvement in the movement. The movement itself, the kinetic energy of the poem communicates a certain level of experience. So this disruption of conventional writing opened up Malayalam poetry. And there are several poets here. Since my essay before me is... and that's why I say the critical writings by Ayyappa Panikar or Agyey or Muktibodh, I will briefly mention Muktibodh in Hindi. You see, Muktibodh, Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh, he was bilingual. He was a Marathi writer as well as his brother Sharat Chandra Muktibodh was a great Marathi writer. Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh was a Hindi writer. He, for example, writes in an essay. He has several essays on new poetry and the new sensibility. And there he very clearly argues that we need to look outside India, and he talks about societies of Africa, Asia, Latin America, where new images, new ideas of poetry, they are emerging. And this search for an avant-garde idiom, perhaps you cannot understand a poet like Ayyappa Panikar or Kadamenita without reference to a painter like K.C.S. Panikar. You see, modernism happens in Malayalam not in poetry alone. It happens in painting, in drama, in short story, in many forms. K.C.S. Panikar, who established Cholamandalam, you see, look at the kind of, he also began as a very traditional landscape painter. But then he starts experimenting. There are paintings where he uses, for example, when there are rituals performed in temple or in our houses or during Theyyam festival, etc., you draw many figures. So he uses a whole set of such ideograms, calligraphy. He writes Malayalam into the painting. Some kind of, I don't know whether these days you talk of ritual killing a lot, you see. There are, when a magic, black magic is, you see, Om Hreem, etc. There are various kind of mantras. You see, there are paintings where K.C.S. Panikar uses such writings as part of the painting. Letters become part of the paintings. So when you read a poem like Varagal Varnangal by Kadamanita, Kadamanita was in Madras, K.C.S. Panikar, Kadamanita, they were all part of M. Govindan group in Madras. There were similar groups in Allahabad, in Bombay, in Calcutta. So modernism develops in India through many such avant-garde groups. Bombay was a great capital for painters. We know D'Souza, lots of new, all these abstract painters. They actually found Bombay as one of the main centers. So the give and take between the exchanges, transaction between painters and poets, and also between a lot of travel. You see, travel and translation are extremely important. If you are students of comparative literature or literature, you will have to look at how writers travel, how writers translate. Modernism largely became Indian through waves and waves of translation. In Malayalam, it all began with Kesari Balakrishna Pilla, then Kerala Kavida in Ayyappa Panikar's journal, translated so much of poetry. Every poet, Kadamanita translates Octavia Paz, Sachidanandan translates African poetry. So lots of translations came into Indian languages. And we cannot understand how a certain avant-garde idiom becomes part of Indian languages. I was talking about Madhekar. Madhekar was in London in the 30s. This is very important. He was in London. He must have heard about T.S. Eliot. He tried to write poetry in English. B.S. Madhekar. Later on he came and joined All India Radio. And for writing poetry in Marathi, a case was filed against him because there were poems where he mentioned, people said they are obscene. The charge against him was he wrote obscene poetry. And there was a long argument in my book, Making It New. I have actually quoted the, when poetry is discussed in the court, two advocates, analyzing the poem, and the judge sitting, it's a very interesting situation. It's not a classroom, it's a court. And he was transferred from Bombay, he was transferred to Pondicherry, and he had to suffer a lot for writing poetry. So Adhunik Kavida became part of India not by winning a lot of awards and getting money. All these poets were put to a whole set of. Same was the experience of Muktibodh, Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh, a versatile Hindi writer, a great critic. He had written a book on Indian Samskriti, the cultural history of India. And it so happened that the Madhya Pradesh government prescribed it as a textbook. And he was quite happy, at least some money will come. He was living in utter poverty. And then came a complaint that this book contains the right-wing group. Now it has become a familiar scene. You see, he had actually criticized a certain revivalist idea, and the RSS kind of organizations complained that this book can never be a textbook. And what the government did was to withdraw the book. Not only was the book withdrawn, but he was subjected to a whole lot of insult, humiliation. And then he wrote the poem Andhere Mein, Iruttil. Andhere Mein I consider is an Indian wasteland. No other poem. It's in about 8 sections, a long poem. And you find, he had already lost his job twice. He was in All India Radio, but he was dismissed from All India Radio because some people wrote to the government saying he's a communist. Those days that was enough. So he lost the job. He was living in a small village, a rural place, in a high school, then in a small college. At least he thought this book will give some credit, and then the book was banned. So a versatile poet of Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh's stature was, and in 1964 when he died, not a single poetry volume by Muktibodh was published. He died in All India Institute of Medical Sciences when none of his poetry volumes were out. Within 2 years, one poetry volume came, Chand ka muh teda hai. Can you understand that much Hindi? The face of the moon is crooked. That itself tells you it's such a rejection of the very idea of beauty. Chand ka muh teda hai. You see, the face of the moon is distorted. And that became an instant classic in Hindi. And within 4 or 5 years, Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh became the major person, died in poverty, penury in 64. It was thanks to some students and friends that he got medical attention. But by the end of 60s, he overtook all other, he was a looming figure in modern Indian and modern Hindi poetry. I mention this with examples because a poem like Kurukshetra, when it was given to Madhubhumi weekly, Madhubhumi was the leading literary, even now perhaps people think it's the leading literary weekly publication in Malayalam. N.V. Krishnavadiyar was the editor. He kept the poem for many months. He did not return it to Ayyappa Panikar, but he did not publish it also. So finally, in 1960, it did not get published. M.V. Devan, he carried that manuscript. It came out in a small journal called Deshabandhu from Kollam. So if you look at how modernism took root in Indian languages, you can see the resistance is as much important as reception. I would say resistance was a mode of reception. And this actually is a pattern you find in Marathi, Malayalam and many other languages. So I will actually wind up by saying, maybe if there are questions I can answer a few. From 30s to 60s, you find a wave of modernist shifts in Indian languages. If it was 30s, early 40s in Bengali, middle 40s and late 40s in Hindi, late 40s, early 50s in Marathi, late 50s, early 60s in Malayalam, and also Gujarati. You find the map of modernism through a series of waves. And there are poets who believe in, for example, a poet like Adiga was an out-and-out right-wing crusader. And we know poets like in Marathi poets, many of them, like Kalady, they were all radical leftists. So you find it was not a monolithic movement. It had different ideologies. It had intertextual relation with painting, not only painting in look at Sri and Srikanthan Nayar's Ramayana plays. They all came out of the same kind of turmoil. 50s, 60s definitely was a turbulent period, a time of great turbulence. And that turbulence found expression through a series of poetic composition which did not conform to the prevailing conventions of poetry. I think that disruption has given a certain kind of kinetic push to Malayalam sensibility. If it has evolved subsequently in many other ways, this I was talking about the shift, modernist shift in Indian languages. I did not want to say it all came from the great poem called The Wasteland. No, I am not saying that. But there was a certain way of moving away from conventional modes of expression, a new relation between form and content, a kind of voice, the quality of voice which it embodied in the sound structure of poetry. All this in a way shaped a new sensibility. Thank you for listening, and I hope if there are questions I would like to actually answer. 5 to 10 minutes.
എന്തെങ്കിലും ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസോ ക്ലാരിഫിക്കേഷൻസോ മറ്റോ ആവശ്യമുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ വളരെ ക്വിക്കായിട്ട് നമുക്കൊന്ന് ചോദിക്കാവുന്നതാണ്. നമുക്കതിന് ശേഷം പേപ്പർ പ്രസന്റേഷൻസിലേക്ക് നീങ്ങേണ്ടതുണ്ട്. ഒന്ന് തുടങ്ങി വെക്കുന്നതിന് വേണ്ടി സർ ഒരു സാറിന്റെ ഒരു ഒബ്സർവേഷൻ കിട്ടിയാൽ കൊള്ളാമെന്നുണ്ട്. എസ്പെഷ്യലി വെൻ യു ആർ ടോക്കിംഗ് അബൌട്ട് ദ 1930s ആൻഡ് ദ ബംഗാളി modernism or later on Marathi modernism, and when you place it in the context of Indian writing in English, I was just wondering, why that modernism did not perhaps happen in Indian writing in English, though it was written in English as early as it happened in Bengali or elsewhere. We usually consider modernism in Indian writing in English with people like Ezekiel and many others, much later than what happened in Bengali or Marathi probably. So, would you please that?
In fact, that's an interesting question. Nissim Iskil's volume, Time to Change, it comes in 1960. You see, Iskil was in London. He also had first-hand experience of many English poets. But I think with the exception of Dom Morris, none of them really could imbibe the spirit of modernism in the true spirit. It took almost, I think, 60s, 70s. I would find the first modernist poem in Indian English was the missing person, Adil Jasawala. You see, Adil Jasawala becomes one of the early Indian English poets who actually communicates the avant-garde sensibility. And then you find Jejuri. These poems come late 60s, early 70s. None of the, Kamala Das, of course, writes in the 60s, but her context is modernist. But 50s, no. You don't find a few poets actually, and Indian English poetry was yet to take a kind of comprehensive shape. You find lots of poets are writing, but they are all not part of identifiable group. Yes, this is a very important question. Anything else? മലയാളത്തിൽ ചോദിക്കാം, ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ ചോദിക്കണം നിർബന്ധമൊന്നുമില്ല. You all seem to be tired, so we'll stop here.
BC ഹാരിസ് വൈജ്ഞാനിക സദസ്സിൻ്റെ രണ്ടാമത്തെ സെഷൻ ഇവിടെ അവസാനിക്കുകയാണ്. എല്ലാവർക്കും നന്ദി പറയുന്നു. അതോടൊപ്പം സെഷൻസിലെ നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ സ്വീകാര്യതയും പ്രതിരോധവും ഇന്ത്യൻ കാവ്യ സാഹിത്യത്തിൽ എന്ന വിഷയത്തിൽ വളരെ പ്രതിരോധവും സ്വീകാര്യതയും എന്ന വിഷയത്തിൽ വളരെ വിശദമായ ഒരു ചർച്ച ആവശ്യപ്പെടേണ്ടതാണ്. പക്ഷേ അത്തരമൊരു ചർച്ചയിലേക്ക് പോകാവുന്ന ഒരവസ്ഥയിലെല്ലാം തോന്നുന്നു നമ്മൾ രണ്ടാം സെഷനിലും തോന്നുന്നു. അതായത് ഈ ഒരു ഇതിന്റെ ഭാഗമായി നമ്മുടെ എല്ലാ സുഹൃത്തുക്കളെയും അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ രാമകൃഷ്ണൻ സാർ